Hi, good evening everyone, and welcome to St Anne's Ryde this evening. It's lovely to see you all here for this opportunity to hear from our state election candidates for the Ryde electorate. My name's David Braga and I'm a member of the 10 o'clock service here at St Anne's. And our Minister, Reverend Andrew Levy, asked me to host this evening. I'm not sure why he chose not to do it himself, but that's okay, you can ask him later. But a big welcome from him as well. I'm going to start with an acknowledgement of country, which I'm sure we'd all recognise as an important aspect as we meet on this land. Since long ago, the land we call Australia has been the home of the Aboriginal people and other First Nations peoples. And where St Anne's now stands live the families of the Wallumattagal people. Here they met together, gathered food and fished the Parramatta River. Here they brought up their children, passing on to them their language, laws, knowledge, stories, songs and ways of life. And here, we gathered today do the same for our families. We acknowledge the Wallumattagal people and all First Nations people here present and pay our respects to them as the first carers of this land. As we live in these ancient lands, we also acknowledge our God who made the heavens and the earth and to whom we are all responsible for the current care of country around us. We're delighted to be hosting this evening and we've invited people from all around the electorate to hear these candidates, not just from this one church. So the invitation included St Charles Gladesville at Ryde, the C3 Church at Ryde, North Ryde Baptist Church, North Ryde Uniting Church, Macquarie Anglican Churches, Christchurch Gladesville, Ryde Presbyterian Church, Soul Revival Ryde and West Ryde Anglican Church. So if you're from any of those communities, welcome to this evening and it's great to have you here with us. So now, while we're hosting this in an Anglican church today, we do live in a pluralist society that needs to have space to ensure that all people can live side by side, irrespective of each person's beliefs. So we also want to show our respect for everyone present, no matter of your past or present faith. Some of what we do tonight will be specifically Christian in nature, and I trust that this won't cause anyone offence. As Christians, we believe that God made the world and made us in his image, and therefore we care for and love for all people. We also believe that Jesus is King of all people and has granted authority for human governments. Irrespective of the type of government, we are called to be subject to the government, and those in government are called to rule justly and wisely. We are privileged in Australia to have an active democracy, and we're very thankful for the stability and confidence we can have in our government. I can safely say that irrespective of any of our personal preferences, we'll be praying for whoever the successful candidate is and asking that they will govern wisely and equally for all people. So please join with me in an opening prayer and I'll pray for that. Sovereign Father and Lord of all, we thank you for the opportunity to meet this evening and hear from Lyndall and Jordan as they stand for election in the upcoming New South Wales state election. Thank you for their willingness to be considered for public office. We ask that this evening we will have an enjoyable time of listening to each other and that this will help guide and inform us as the voters in making a wise and considered choice of candidate for our seat of Ryde. Heavenly Father and Judge of all, we know that the governing authorities we live under are established by your hand and remain in power thanks to your good provision. Irrespective of the outcome of this election, we ask that you will guide the New South Wales government and opposition to seek wise counsel and look to provide leadership and make decisions that are from a deep sense of their duty to the people they represent. Help them to have courage and to seek your guidance as they do so. Thank you for all who serve us in our state legislature, and we ask that you will be with them as they do their jobs professionally and well. Amen. So a couple of basic announcements before we get the evening underway. Toilets are back out the main door and off to the right if you haven't been in this building before. And in the unlikely case of an emergency, please calmly evacuate the building through the main doors, or if that's not possible, there are side doors as well. Now, how the evening will work, this isn't a debate. We're here to listen respectfully and to each candidate, so to Lyndall and to Jordan, to hear from them who they are and their perspective both as individuals and also of their party. We're hoping to do that in a way that is very helpful for each of us as voters, and you may not get a chance to hear from them in this way elsewhere during the election process. We have invited the candidates from the two main parties who are seeking to form government. And the way this will work is I'll ask the questions that we're going to put to them, and we'll alternate who goes first for each question. They do have a time limit, which they've been told about, and so without being too rude, I'll give them a 30-second warning and ask them to stop when they get to their time limit. This evening is being live streamed, so we want to say welcome to those who are watching remotely, and thank you for joining us tonight. We do welcome questions from everyone in the room, so you've been given a pencil and a little piece of paper. So if you want to ask a question of the candidate, please, or of the two candidates, please write it down and people will collect those from you, and then I'll ask the questions a little later on. We do have some set questions as well that have been asked of candidates around the whole state. So we're going to lead off now, and after a very complex process of discussion, we've asked Jordan to go first. And so Jordan, in about 5 minutes, what are you passionate about for the Ryde area? Thank you.
We should give you a clap, Dave. You've done very well. Thank you. Good morning, Al. Good morning. It's good evening. My days have been going crazy. It's nice to see everybody. Thank you for having us here. Dave, thanks for moderating. Andrew, up the back, I'd like to know as well why you didn't want to do this today, but I think it's because you're so gracious. We've known you for some time, and it's wonderful of you to have us here, so thank you. And of course, there's a couple of councillors in the room, the Mayor, Councillor Sarkis Udelian, Councillor Justin Lee as well, welcome. And to everybody who's joined from around the various churches in the Ryde and broader Ryde community, thank you for being here. It's an extraordinary thing that we get to do a forum like this. I was reflecting on this today as I was thinking about forums and elections right around the world. There are very few countries in the world where you have this sort of peace and harmony, that people with different views, and I should of course acknowledge Lyndall for being here this evening as well, that people of different views, of different persuasions can come together and have a discussion, put forward a vision, a plan for the future. But your question to me was about that vision and that future. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Jordan Lane. I'm a lifelong local. I was born at Ryde Hospital, been to a number of local primary schools, did my high schooling at Morris College Eastwood. I've served as a councillor, most recently as the Mayor of the City of Ryde, and I've worked in disability as my most recent private sector role. I've left that role so that I can pursue this particular campaign, which is, of course, coming about because we have an election and the retirement of our outgoing MP, Victor Dominello. And so the question then is, what's the future and what does it look like? And some of the things that I'm particularly passionate about, I've left some literature in the front, is of course in relation to the substantial pipeline of infrastructure investments in this community. I am particularly proud of what the government in the last number of years has done in securing funding, $479 million to essentially rebuild Ryde Hospital, a place that I know many locals were born. Why that's so significant is because in my lifetime, that hospital hasn't been the subject of a substantial rebuild or upgrade, and I think it's long overdue. It's a substantial investment. I'm particularly proud of the work they've done, but of course, my job, if I'm successful in March, is to deliver it, is to get it done. And so that is one of my substantial priorities. Of course, we have, again, a substantial pipeline of education investment as well. In the last term, there were around 8 new and upgraded schools for this local community. 8. That is the single greatest education investment in the history of this community, but there's more to do. And so over the course of the next term and beyond, there's at least 3 extras in the pipeline, which I think are particularly important. Because education is one of those things that if you get right, you can set the trajectory of a child's life well into the future, but you have to have good facilities, and that's what the investment is all about. And then thirdly, in relation again to infrastructure, but transport and road infrastructure, is the work that's been done over the course of the last particularly 8 or so years with improving a lot of our really problematic intersections. Places up in Macquarie Park which have sustained extraordinary growth. And if you go up there now, you'll see road widenings, resurfacing, and a significant amount of investment that's gone into making what is essentially the Silicon Valley of Ryde a much easier place to move and get around. But it doesn't stop there, because we know that in the previous term, the government committed to the widening of Victoria Road at West Ryde. Now, I live in Meadowbank. Anybody who lives in this local community knows that it's one of the most substantial pinch points anywhere in Sydney. And so to be able to see that project through, commit the additional funding that's needed. In fact, just in the last week, we've had a new injection of funds into that project, and to continue to pursue what is a long-term and complicated project is vitally important. There's a lot at stake at this election, and a lot of work that's in the pipeline. And my candidacy is all about delivering on what has been a well-articulated and positive vision, continuing to stay the course, and as we always say in our campaign slogans, keep New South Wales moving forward. So I'm very happy to take questions at the end of this forum, but it's a real great honour to be here, of course, with Lyndall and with all of you, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the forum. Thank you, Dave.
Thanks, Jordan. And Lyndall, now for you. What makes you passionate about the Ryde area? Thank you.
Good evening. Good evening, Jordan. Good evening, Dave. Good evening, Andrew, to everyone online, councillors in the room. It really is a pleasure to be here tonight. And it's our first candidates forum, one of several, I think. So looking forward to having the contest of ideas and discussing and clarifying what I stand for, what the Labor vision is for Ryde, and how we can actually deliver on that and be accountable for that. So, a bit about me. My name is Lyndall Howison. I've lived in Ryde for 10 years. I've raised my daughter here with my husband. She attended a local primary school. We're very connected to our community in a range of different ways. It's really lovely to see people here tonight that I've known for a number of years in very different ways. Hi, John. So, a bit about me before I move on to my vision for Ryde. I'm currently working as a high school teacher. I work in a public high school in Western Sydney where I teach geography and commerce. It's an incredibly rewarding job, but a career and a profession that's under pressure. So my vision for a Labor government and for Ryde is to really tackle the teaching crisis, which is affecting student learning in this state. So that's something I'm hearing time and time again, and I've seen it in my own work, and my colleagues are struggling under that pressure, and that's something that we really will tackle and address with a new government in this state. Prior to being a teacher, I have been a local government councillor in Leichhardt. So before I moved to Ryde, many years ago, I lived in the inner west. Leichhardt Council did some things very well. It was a council that addressed heritage management very carefully and also tackled the questions of community consultation, very robust involvement in community and in planning decisions at Leichhardt Council. So this is a template that I'd seek to implement and apply as a state member of Parliament as well. A wonderful experience. Prior to that, I've also worked in the not-for-profit sector like Jordan, in communications management, and also in the finance sector, and I've lived overseas. So I've had a range of different experiences, and I think together they give me a unique perspective on what it means to be a state member of Parliament, and it would be the honour and the privilege of my life to represent Ryde in that way. So my vision for this area is to maintain all the wonderful things. We've been ably represented by our current Member of Parliament for 14 years. The wonderful things that make Ryde special, a great place to raise a family, to have a business, to educate your children or your family members. All of those things need to be maintained. All of those things are under pressure currently. So conversations that I'm having as I walk around Ryde and meet people at events like this and at door knocking and street stalls, the conversations that I'm having are around the pressures in our local schools, the promises that we've had for a new high school which haven't been delivered, the cuts to buses as a result of privatisation that we need to tackle and unwind under a Labor government, and other things that we can do to support our local community in relation to transport, in relation to privatisation and cost of living. So we have a positive plan around that as a Minns Labor government. So, as a teacher, one of the most rewarding things is to help my students understand and empower them in relation to their role in their local community and the global economy and the natural environment. So I really am very passionate about my subjects of geography and commerce, and these are skills and perspectives that I would bring to the state, the role as State Member of Parliament as well. We need to empower our community to participate in our local economy, to participate in and support and value our natural environment, and I just think those things are more important than anything else. We can do that and achieve great outcomes in relation to economic management. We've seen it happen before and it can happen again. So again, I'm looking forward to the rest of this event. We've got some questions coming that we're aware of. We've got some questions from the floor. I thank you all for being in this room. David and I were just saying it's a rare breed of person that comes to an event like this. Some people that I speak to aren't really aware of the state election that's coming up. So thank you for being here, and I look forward to those questions.
Thanks, Lyndall. Yeah, when I agreed to MC it, I was thinking, gosh, what happens if there's only 4 people here? So I'm very grateful that you're all here as well. Thank you for being here this evening. Now, we do have a number of set questions that were provided to Lyndall and to Jordan in advance. They're consistent questions that are being asked around the state, actually. And so we'll hear from them first on those. Feel free to scribble away. As I said before, there's also going to be a chance to hear your questions. So if you want to write those down and pass them in, that'd be great. Now, these questions are more specifically oriented for us as people of faith and particularly as Christians. And I think they're important to ask because sometimes there's a party position on different topics, and we all understand how politics work and the expectations that you vote with your party. But equally, sometimes you're given freedom of conscience and the ability to vote as an individual. And so it's actually very helpful to hear how each of you think on these matters. So I think in the spirit of swapping around, Lyndall, you're first, aren't you? But I think we've got a video for this first question. So let's show the video and then I'll ask the question.
Religious people and organisations have long played a crucial role in our communities. A large proportion of our education, health and social services are provided by faith-based organisations, and nearly all of Australia's largest charities have Christian roots. People of faith continue to contribute to our society's welfare because of their religious values, and governments recognise their contributions by partnering with them to deliver important services. This is now under threat from new laws that undermine the very heart and soul of faith-based organisations. As a result of recent amendments to anti-discrimination law in various states, faith-based organisations such as churches, synagogues, mosques, religious schools, charities and aged care can no longer insist that their staff adhere to or model their religious beliefs and values. At the federal level, the recent Australian Law Reform Commission consultation paper issued at the request of the Labor government, escalates this threat. This strikes at the heart of a religious organisation's ability to preserve their ethos and effectively carry out their religious mission in service to their communities, and is a huge blow to both religious freedom and freedom of association. This is happening despite a growing awareness of people being seriously mistreated because of their religion, and the wide consensus that religious freedom is vital and needs to be protected. While it is right and proper to protect individuals from unjust discrimination, these new laws fail to get the balance right between the freedom of people of faith to operate faith-based institutions and the freedom of individuals who do not support that faith. And it is not hard to get the balance right. The Commonwealth Religious Discrimination Bill had bipartisan support on this issue, and the New South Wales Religious Freedoms and Equality Bill had the support of a bipartisan Joint Select Committee. Each of these had sensible mechanisms that provided robust protection against religious discrimination for individuals, while at the same time recognising that it was not discriminatory for religious bodies to operate in accordance with their religious beliefs. We allow other groups formed around a set of values, such as unions and political parties, to employ people who agree with their beliefs and ethos, but are now at risk of denying the same right to faith-based organisations. This state election, ask your candidates, will you support legislation that both protects religious individuals from discrimination while also protecting the freedom of religious bodies to operate in accordance with their values and to preference staff who align with them?
So thank you. So the question's on the screen. So Linda, will you support legislation that protects the freedom of religious bodies to operate in accordance with their values and to preference staff who align with them? Thank you. 3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay. So the very short answer is yes. Is that great? Thank you. The very short answer is yes. And I think there is a good basis for that. I would query one point that was made in that video, which is that the solution is simple. I don't actually think it is. So just to clarify a little bit around that and what Labor will do to respect the freedom of religious bodies to operate in accordance with their values, to get the answer correct. So that bill is a federal bill and this is a state election, but I welcome the debate and the discussion. I would note that the Prime Minister has, now let me get the wording for this right, reaffirmed a commitment to allow religious schools to hire staff based on faith. So a lot of this is about schools, and we saw though, however, on that screen, a range of different organisations that also seek to hire staff based on faith. That commitment needs to come with a balance to protect people who are already working in organisations from discrimination. But I have complete faith that as a country and as a community that we can have that conversation and find those solutions respectfully. One thing that Chris Minns has committed to, which I think is an important announcement, is a New South Wales Faith Council, which doesn't currently exist in that form, which would act as a consultative body and be an ongoing consultative body for the New South Wales State Government. So we want to make sure that that input is coming on an ongoing basis and the conversation continues. The short answer is yes, I would support that legislation. I don't want to be shy about this. I'm a person of faith myself. I'm a member of a local church. I do know that it is important for religious organisations to have staff in their organisation that reflect their values. So I just think that we need to not oversimplify it and we need to appreciate that the rights of existing staff in organisations need to be respected. But I'm an optimist on this and I think we can find a solution. I just don't think it's simple. So I do come back to that idea that it's an ongoing discussion. The Faith Committee, the Faith Council rather, that Chris Minns has committed to will help with that. But again, the Prime Minister is saying that he wants to absolutely support schools to recruit on that basis, and we can find a way through that at state level as well.
Thanks, Lyndall. Appreciate that. Jordan, from you, will you support legislation that protects the freedom of religious bodies to operate in accordance with their values and to preference staff who align with them? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Look, I probably have a similar view to the Prime Minister's, to be honest, and I think that that's been articulated. The thing that the Premier has already announced with respect to religious discrimination is that in the next term of Parliament there will be a bill introduced. So there will be an opportunity to discuss this because I think it's already been articulated as a priority for the government, and so that's of course something that I would be eager to support. I went to a Catholic school at Eastwood, at Marist, and I've got to say that it was an extraordinary place, providing a great sense of not just education, but a wholesome experience for a whole host of young men that have grown up in this local community. And it came about because of the wonderful staff that they've got. You have to be able to trust your organisations to do the right thing. And I think that that's what, when it comes to schools and any faith-based organisation, we've got to be able to do. Ultimately, we're all Australians, and when it comes to religious discrimination legislation, I guess in a high-level philosophical way, I'd say that those sorts of acts should act as shields rather than swords. And so provided they're there to protect people, to ensure that those that are experiencing vilification or any sort of targeted attack are protected, then I think that's an extraordinarily good thing and something that we should support. So the short answer, of course, is yes, but there's actually something in the pipeline that the Premier's already announced, which will come up in the next term of Parliament. So if I'm successful, that's obviously something that I will be front and centre of, and very happy to continue this discussion, both with you, Andrew, and everybody else, because I know it will be important to your community.
Thank you. Thanks, Jordan. I appreciate that answer as well. The second question we've got is regarding poker machine reform. And I think we've all seen a lot of the stories about the challenge that gambling is in our society. Some data behind that. Apparently Australians lose $25 billion a year in gambling, and about half of that is through poker machines. And tragically, Australia has about 80% of the world's poker machines. I don't know if you knew that. So Jordan, what is your party's response to the Crime Commission's recommendation? But more importantly, what will your party do to address the epidemic of gambling harm in New South Wales? Thank you.
You know, outside of Nevada, New South Wales has more poker machines than any other jurisdiction in the world. It is an extraordinary statistic, and I think it's right and proper that we're having this debate and discussion. Put simply, the Crime Commission report made a series of recommendations, but number one, right up the top, was the introduction of cashless gaming cards. Now, there's two prongs to this solution when it comes to gambling, and you've rightly articulated problem gambling and the scourge of addiction right across our state. Cashless gaming helps address that, because we know that people often walk into a venue with an idea in their mind of how much money they're going to spend. And then in the cut and thrust of the I suppose, the session, the gambling session, the lights, addiction is a complicated thing and people go way over their heads. The introduction of the cashless gaming card allows you to control back when you're thinking about how much you want to spend, the amount that you will inevitably spend when you walk into that gaming room. I think that's a very powerful solution to something that you may not be able to control once you end up, if you are a person experiencing addiction, in a gaming room. But the second part, and where this all comes from, of course, is the Crime Commission report. This is just as much about trying to address organised crime and money laundering in particular as it is about problem gambling. Poker machines are one of the last bastions that exist in the community where you can significantly wash large sums of cash, because we know when you go to a poker machine, you can maybe lose 30%. But if you're walking away with 70% of $1 million, say that's an illegally gained $1 million, that's 700,000 clean dollars that you've just walked out of that gaming room with. That's a terrible, terrible thing. So the cashless gaming card allows for red flags to be raised when those kinds of quantities going through the machines, and I think it means that the local pub and club doesn't become a place, frankly, of organised crime. It's a terrible, terrible scourge. So I think the Premier has been very clear about his support of all the recommendations from the Crime Commission report. It's a view I hold personally very strongly. I'm not a gambler myself, but I look around our community and I think we can do so much better, and I'm so very pleased that the Pirate government has taken a position that it will legislate these cashless gaming cards right across the state, whilst of course we work with our local pubs and clubs, particularly in regional areas, to ensure that they can accommodate this transition period. We know it's a big deal for them, but I think it is morally right, it's objectively right, and it's the right thing to do by not only our vulnerable citizens, but to crack down on organised crime.
Thanks, Jordan. Appreciate that answer as well. Lyndall, what is your party's response to the Crime Commission's recommendation, and more importantly, what will your party do to address this epidemic of gambling harm in New South Wales? Thank you.
I think the big difference between the two parties has been well canvassed. I think that had initially been set up as quite a contradictory position, but what we've seen more recently in the media narrative is that we have two parties. We have two parties that are committed to gambling reform, and we have bipartisan support for that as an outcome for this state. And we have two slightly different methods of getting to that same place. So the main difference, of course, is the question of the trial for the cashless gaming cards, and the reason for that is the need for an evidence base. So as Jordan has rightly said, the Crime Commissioner's report, which came out in October, was a sad indictment of gambling in this state. And one of the things that I took away from that was the quote that gambling in New South Wales is a $95 billion information black hole. We don't actually know how much money laundering is happening through poker machines. We know there is some. We must reform this, but we need to understand exactly how cashless gaming will work, and that's the purpose of the trial, to deliver a solid evidence base for a solid reform that will stick. So there is a plan to implement, there is a roadmap for implementing cashless gaming card under the Labor policy. It's not a policy that lends itself to a neat media soundbite. So it talks about reducing the overall number in the state of poker machines. It talks about reducing the daily limit per machine from 5,000 to 500. It talks about banning the external signage. The VIP lounge signage would go under the Labor policy. It also talks about baking in the input of harm minimisation experts, because we acknowledge that this is a mental health challenge, and it is one that is having terrible, terrible effects on some of the most disadvantaged people, particularly in our city, particularly in the west and the southwest of our city. I stand before you as someone who knows someone very well who suffered from this as an addiction. I don't like poker machines. So as your state member, I would be in Parliament advocating for that reform program to continue. But I do have to say that I know that Chris Minns is serious about reform, and I do believe that the two parties, I take great comfort from the fact that there is bipartisan support for gambling reform, and that the two parties will achieve major reforms in this space. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lyndall. So the next question is on religious education in schools, so special religious education, and we've got a video again. Thank you.
I'm Tom Eastlake, and I'm a Christian special religious or education or an SRE teacher in a New South Wales public school. And I'm also a representative of the Interchurch Commission for Religious Education in Schools. In recognition of the benefit of SRE to both students and broader society, the opportunity to opt into SRE classes in New South Wales in public schools is supported by not just the majority of the public, but also both sides of New South Wales Parliament. SRE supports multiculturalism, it counters religious bullying, it supports cultural and religious identity, and it supports a student's spiritual well-being, which is one of the 5 pillars that the Department of Education has identified as critical to a student's ability to connect, succeed, and thrive. But to support the continuation of SRE, we're asking for your help. Historically, the school enrolment form has included a question on religious identity, but this has been removed. This question existed to allow both the Department of Education and the SRE community to do the same thing as an enrolment question does about a student's learning needs or their medical history, and that's what that seeks to do today. It allows the school and the SRE community to deploy resources to ensure that a student's well-being, their spiritual well-being, is supported in line with the well-being framework for schools. This, rightly, helps the Department of Education ensure that appropriate resources and care are offered to all students enrolled in public schools in New South Wales. Since this question has been removed from the enrolment form, it has become increasingly difficult to support SRE in schools. The reality is that schools can't host and SRE teachers can't teach classes in schools if they don't know where the students are. So in standing for New South Wales Parliament in 2023, our question is, are you willing to confirm your support for SRE and commit to seeing the reintroduction of the religious identity question to the school enrolment form?
Thank you. So just to restate the question, and Lyndall, I think you're up first this time. Are you willing to confirm your support for SRE and commit to seeing the reintroduction of the religious identity question on the school enrolment form? Thank you.
Yes. So Labor is prepared to support SRE as an option for parents, with the also equivalent or sort of partnered option of an ethics program as well. SRE is something that is, it's hard for me to talk about in a sort of way. I know someone very close to me who delivers those classes and finds it an incredibly rewarding experience. As a teacher, it's actually quite challenging in a public school because the classes are sometimes not timetabled and it's done on a school-by-school basis. So SRE in some schools is something that actually teachers find tricky to grapple with. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. It's hard to know whether or not your class will be learning in that lesson or if they'll be doing SRE, and sometimes you don't find that out to the last minute because SRE is often delivered by volunteers, and we all know that volunteer organisations, you know, volunteers kind of are the heart of the nation in a funny sort of way, but everybody has challenges and sometimes those things are really hard to deliver on a consistent basis. So we need to do it better. We have research this week that tells us that student wellbeing programs have suffered post-COVID, and we know that there is what's close to an epidemic in relation to mental health challenges in New South Wales schools. So SRE and SEE, the ethics programs, are part of that constellation of programs that help students reconnect with wellbeing, with school culture, with social connections, with that idea that there's people outside their school and outside their family that care about their mental health and care about their understanding of the world and their development as people potentially of faith or people who have emerging understanding of the world and each other. I think SRE is really important. Secondly, yes, Labor is happy to work towards reintegration of the religious identity question into the school enrolment forms.
Thank you so much, Lyndall. And Jordan, for yourself, are you willing to confirm your support for SRE and commit to seeing the reintroduction of the religious identity question to the school enrolment form? Thank you, Jordan.
I had a great time doing SRE classes myself when I was at school. I think they're enormously valuable. I think that what's particularly great about them is that now, back when I was at school, they didn't offer even the ethics class. So you could do scripture or you did non-scripture, and the people in non-scripture would basically sit around and colour in and do nothing. So I think that where the government's moved now with offering the existing special religious education coupled with the ethics classes, I think gives parents an incredible amount of choice around what they do. But I just think it's incredibly valuable in providing a holistic experience for kids when they go to school. So I'm very, very supportive. And in relation to this is fundamentally a data question, and I'm pleased that you've raised it because, of course, our local MP, Victor's a bit of a data nerd, and I've learned a few things from him over the years when it comes to the value of this sort of stuff. Because if you've got better information, better data, better understanding of the people that you're there to serve, then you can, of course, offer better services in real time and resource things properly. So I think that it's all, frankly, a little bit of a no-brainer, but I appreciate it's an important issue for the community. But I've got a lived experience. I'm very supportive of where we're heading with all of this, and I'm particularly a big supporter of the choice we're now giving parents that I never got the pleasure of enjoying, which was the alternate choice of the ethics classes as well. I think that provides that rounded education that's so vitally important. So, of course, it's a good thing.
Thanks, Jordan. And I saw Andrew just teed off the boxes again to get questions. So this is the last set question. So if you've got something you'd really like asked, make sure that you put it through. Our last question in the set questions is on affordable housing. It wouldn't be a meeting in Sydney of people without talking about house prices. But we all know how life-changing it is to have access to secure and affordable housing, and particularly for people on a single income or who aren't able to access the regular rental market. And, you know, again, we can all see the stories of the trauma that this can create. So, Jordan, how will you invest in social and affordable housing?
This, as you've rightly said, is a really important question for Sydney, and there's probably a bit of a shopping list of things which I'll jump through quickly in the brief time that I've got. First of all, since 2012, there's been 12,400 new social and affordable housing homes built across the state, which is an extraordinary increase. I think it's 8.4% increase on the previous trajectory of housing. So that's making a real difference across the board, which I think is vitally important. But something that's occupying a lot of the media debate and discussion now is in relation to how do you get first home buyers, people who are often younger professionals or people as well who throughout the course of their life haven't had an opportunity to get onto the housing ladder, if you like. How do you get those people in? We know it provides an enormous amount of physical and personal security as well as economic opportunity and uplift. So one of the things that the government has announced, and which the Premier has been a strong advocate for, has been the introduction, and I'll come back to this word, of choice when it comes to opting into a land tax as opposed to paying an upfront stamp duty. We know that one of the big things that stops particularly young people is getting a deposit to be able to afford a home. If you are able to reduce the amount at the outset that you need to get into the housing market, then more people can afford a home. So by allowing somebody to opt into the land tax, you reduce the stamp duty component, which is frankly a huge contributor to that initial deposit, so that a person with frankly a modest income can still afford to get onto the housing market. What the Premier has announced in recent days has been that for those who've acquired a first home through that scheme, that they can continue and roll that over into a second home as they inevitably grow their family, have children, or need to expand or move. So I think that's a really important thing for getting people into the market in the first place. But you rightly pointed out, Dave, a couple of key groups in the community, people, single incomes or single mothers, people that are over the age of 50, and of course our frontline workers as well, who we need housed in places where their work is so important. And that's why the government's shared equity scheme is so valuable, giving people the opportunity to basically go in partnership with the government up to 40% of the value of a new build, 30% in the value of an existing build, so that they can again get that first step onto the housing ladder. But planning is also an important part of this. It's not just about state government programs. There also needs to be cohesion with your, in particular, local governments. One of the things that I did last year when I was the Mayor was to commence what I would describe a very, very long overdue planning reforms for Ryde. And one of the key components that is driving these reforms is how do we get more housing in the right places, not just more housing for the sake of it. Ryde has frankly been overdeveloped, but we need to be strategic, and an important strategic consideration when it comes to planning is social and affordable housing. So it's a key benchmark that we're working against, and something I was proud to deliver last year as Mayor.
Thanks, Jordan. Appreciate all the thought on that as well. Lyndall, how will you invest in social and affordable housing? Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. We have to reframe as well how we think about affordable housing, and we must take renters into consideration when we're talking about affordable housing. We know that around 40% of the Ryde electorate actually rent, and renters are so often forgotten when it comes to these matters. So Labor has a key focus on the rights of renters. We will appoint a rental commissioner to act independently of government in support of and in advocacy for renters. We will ban secret rent bidding, and we will make it much harder for unfair evictions to take place. So 40% of our electorate rent in Ryde, and they are too often forgotten when it comes to questions of affordable housing. I must take issue on the question of delivery of social housing. The record numbers of people on the wait list for social housing would dispute the claim that social housing has been added in New South Wales. It's simply not backed up by the numbers. So what Labor will do in government is an immediate audit of all government land, and we will commit to 50% of that land being delivered for social and affordable housing, so that we can actually deliver land that's adjacent to transport nodes, transport hubs, and make that 50% affordable housing. We must deliver more social and affordable housing in this state and in the right places. As Jordan has said, there is a bit of a disconnect sometimes between the questions of supply and the questions of infrastructure delivery when it comes to where do we put those people who are going to be living in increased places of increased density. So Labor will review the priorities and the functions of the Greater Sydney Commission to ensure we have better alignment between places of population growth and infrastructure and transport modes. So we've seen just in the last week our local planning minister from the neighbouring electorate announce fast-track development of a new region of southwest Sydney that is not backed up by any of the experts in relation to its incredible distance from places of employment and other sources of services, hospitals and schools. It's not the right place to put new homes. It's not the right way to do it, to fast-track that kind of development at 3 weeks out from an election or 4 weeks out from an election. So we need to have the Greater Sydney Commission playing a stronger role. We need better alignment between infrastructure services and population growth. And we must deliver more social and affordable housing in this state. 55,000 people on the waiting list is unacceptable for me. It should be unacceptable for anyone, any person of faith. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Lyndall. So, as I said, that is the end of our set questions. So we've got a number that have come in from everyone, so thank you for these questions. Going to start topically on hospitals. So one very specific question, and Lyndall, I think you're up first and then Jordan. How will the nurse ratio for beds for patients, the nurse ratio to beds for patients be monitored across 3 shifts daily? How will it be funded? So I think the question is essentially pressing into the question of nurse funding and making sure that patients have access right across the full day. Thank you, Lyndall.
I think this question relates to Labor's policy of safer staffing levels, which is designed to deliver what we believe to be a significantly improved staffing allocation in hospitals in this state. We have a terribly burnt out workforce for our nurses, and Labor is seeking to dramatically and drastically increase the staffing levels in the health system. That is one key difference in relation to Ryde Hospital between Labor and Liberal. So of course, the Ryde Hospital redevelopment, $479 million, that funding was announced before the last state election. It is in the budget. A Labor government will proceed with Ryde Hospital's redevelopment. It's terribly overdue. I would like to see the progress on that infrastructure accelerated somewhat. So just before the last election, we had the funding announcement. Just before this election, we have design concepts, but no planning proposal yet. So let's get moving with Ryde Hospital under Labor or Liberal government. But a Ryde Hospital delivered under a Labor government will have safer staffing levels, which will deliver more staff on the floor, starting with emergency departments and rolling out across other wards, to relieve the terrible burden that our nurses are currently feeling, which is causing them to leave this profession and creating a real crisis in our health system.
Thank you. Thanks, Lyndall. So, Jordan, what's your view on this topic of the relationship of funding for nurses? Thank you.
So I understand that neither party has made a commitment in relation to a hard nurse-to-patient ratio. So I think simply the reason for that is both parties acknowledge that there's an extraordinary cost associated with that. If I can talk a little bit, though, just in a local setting around how we address some of the things with respect to staffing, and it does, of course, relate to the Ryde Hospital rebuild. I'll just run through briefly how funding works when it comes to hospitals, because I think this is really important, and it goes precisely to the point around how do you get good staff here in our local community. It is a very bold and visionary plan. It's almost $500 million, so this is not an overnight task. It does take time. The existing time frame, of course, is to have the hospital built in 2027. That's always been the arrangement. But it's not that simple to say that that's just a pile of money and that's how long it takes. Hospitals are built in stages, particularly Ryde Hospital, and there's one key reason for that, because you have to keep it functioning whilst you're doing the construction work. And so there's a series of stages that it goes through. Tethered to those stages are as well funding allotments. So it is true that over the forward estimates there is a funding envelope that has been allocated, but that only works, it only gets built on time and on that budget if you can continue to keep the hospital in sort of the top 10 number of hospital projects that exist across the state. Across the state. This isn't about just here in Ryde, this is across the state. So part of the role, and something that you should think about when it comes to who it is that you're electing as your local representative for Ryde, is who is it that's going to be able to ensure that the hospital allocations that need to be continually funded each year in the budget keeps it in that top 10. I've been very clear about it being my number one priority for this local electorate, and so I think that it's something that if we're taking seriously, we need to think about how you get to that funding. I'm very pleased that it's going to be delivered, and those concept designs, if you haven't seen, I've got a leaflet, they're fantastic. Everything except for Denniston House is essentially being rebuilt, which I think will make it a wonderful place to visit, to be treated, and of course for our staff, the nurses and doctors, to work, and that's what it's all about. So it's a very exciting announcement, and I can't wait to see it built.
Thank you. Thanks, Jordan. So while we're on the topic of funding, we've got a particular question on hospital funding from a member of the congregation who was previously an associate minister of the church. And so I'll just read it. I'd like to bring to your attention the inequity in provision of chaplaincy services in public hospitals. The large hospitals like Royal North Shore have multiple paid chaplains, whereas our local Ryde hospital has none. When the public were asked about their priorities for the rebuilding of the hospital, chaplaincy and pastoral care services rated very highly. Recently, Minister Brad Hazzard made a one-off grant towards the provision of chaplaincy at Ryde Hospital. My question is, will you commit to ongoing funding for at least one full-time chaplaincy coordinator who will work with a team of volunteers of various faiths and also provide funding for the training and supervision of these volunteers? Thank you, Jordan.
So the funding envelope that's been announced thus far covers a lot of the physical infrastructure. So new medical imaging, new emergency department and sort of entry. There's new theatres for the doctors to work out of. There's short stay paediatrics and a host of other new and expanded services, which are very exciting. On the specific question of the chaplaincy, I'll have to talk to the Health Minister around where that previous advocacy got up to. I'm probably not in a position to make funding announcements here at this forum, of course, but it's something that, if it's been heard from the community, should be taken on board. We meet with the Minister regularly, and we're meeting, of course, with the medical council as well at the hospital, because they drive a lot of the decisions around where the great care and need is. So if we can get some advice from them, it's of course something that should be considered, but I think at the moment there's a substantial amount of money going towards a revitalisation of what's frankly been a rundown hospital, such that it can provide all the critical medical, emergency and frontline services that are needed day to day.
Thank you. Thanks, Jordan. Lyndall, my question is, will you commit to ongoing funding for at least one full-time chaplaincy coordinator who will work with a team of volunteers of various faiths and also provide funding for the training and supervision of these volunteers? Thank you.
It will come of no surprise to you that I'm unable to make a funding commitment tonight either, particularly without knowing what the number is. But I do commend the cause and the intention, and particularly the idea of working with a group of volunteers, which I think is a really fantastically inclusive way of delivering chaplaincy and pastoral care through a hospital, a very important function. I'm interested in the idea of discussions with the Health Minister, since it's my understanding that we don't know who the Health Minister of New South Wales will be after the state election. So we do need to rethink how that would work moving forward. But we do know that the communities work together and that they certainly need those services at a hospital. Ryde Hospital, when it's upgraded, will go up a level. It's currently the same level as the hospital in Gunnedah, and once it's upgraded it will become a district hospital and of course support centres like Westmead and Royal North Shore. So it's right for our community to ask for those pastoral services to be delivered in our district hospital that will come in due course.
Thank you. Thanks, Lyndall. So I'll read the question in the first person because that's how it was written. I live in Meadowbank and in the first stage of the Waterpoint development. In the 18 years I've lived there, I've witnessed massive development. Literally thousands of new homes have been built, but there has not been matching development of roads and other infrastructure. What will you personally do about this? Lyndall.
I think it comes back to that idea that we have a misalignment between the planning, the services and the delivery of increased density. And we see it time and time again. We see communities having to then fight for the spaces in the local high schools and fight for an upgrade to their hospitals, which comes much later than that increased density. So a realignment of the strategic priorities of the Greater Sydney Commission will help with this, and we need to make sure that we continually advocate for delivery of infrastructure in conjunction with increased density. So I obviously spend some time down at Meadowbank. I'm aware of that area. We know that the roundabout down there is under pressure. I'm sure that there is capacity for us to do better when it comes to roads infrastructure. But one thing we don't necessarily always see is that all levels of government working together. So if I was elected, I'd be looking for the partnership of Ryde Council, and I'd be not seeking to make any points around that. I'm a problem solver, I'm not a career politician. So we'd need to sit down at a table together and work through those issues and look for sources of funding across all levels of government and make it happen.
Thanks, Lyndall. And Jordan, for you, so the houses have arrived, but there hasn't been matching development of roads and other infrastructure. What will you personally do about this? Thank you.
Now, this is why I got into politics, because of this very thing. It's why I first ran for council. So I can tell you a little bit about what I've done, and then I can tell you where I think we should be going. One of the biggest failures of planning anywhere in the state is the inability for councils and developers to extract real social infrastructure for communities. That particular development was approved under an old government scheme as a Part 3A scheme. It was a very poorly and wildly rejected form of planning policy. So what this current government did early on in its term was effectively get rid of that piece of legislation, which allowed an individual minister to sign off on DAs. What we need is a far greater collaboration when it comes to building infrastructure. Developers make extraordinary amounts of money. I live in Meadowbank, by the way. I know exactly the building you're talking about. I know exactly the pressures that you've got with the local roads there. And it's not just the road, it's the park, it's overrun, it's everything around that area because of the intensity of development and the lack of follow-up social infrastructure to support it. What we've tried to do in the last term at council was we've tried to reform our local planning controls to do away with these developer deals, where developers come in to the council offering all sorts of essentially cash inducements in order to get special provisions or, I guess, extra height and extra density over what's permitted. We're trying to walk away from all of that because it hasn't worked for Ryde. And I think that that's something we need to take that knowledge, that experience, that lived experience that I've got living in that local community into a decision-making realm so that we can try and take what we've done here on a local level in Ryde, and that I know the new mayor is continuing, and deliver that on a bigger scale as well. But the solution isn't just trying to cram more housing into public land. I know that there are some discussions in this particular debate around addressing housing affordability by just developing public land. That means sites like Sydney Water, which I want to see opened up as a nice recreation space for cafes and dining and all sorts of public use, into housing. That is an appalling outcome for our community in an already over-concentrated local environment. So I think there's a lot of work to do in this space to make sure that councils work better with state government, and I think I'm uniquely placed to do that in this community, given my previous experience and the work that needs to be done into the future, so we can make Ryde a sustainable place. Yes, address all the housing demands, but a sustainable place with real social infrastructure, transport infrastructure, and of course green space and amenity.
Thank you. Thanks, Jordan. So someone's picked up the thought of gambling reform and is asking a question on advertising. So Jordan, you're up first this time. In the 80s and 90s, tobacco advertising was banned because of its harm was acknowledged. Will you act to limit the avalanche of gambling advertising? Jordan.
Yes, I think we should. There's nothing more offensive to me than watching a sporting game and having every second advertisement being about gambling. I also don't like walking past local community pubs and clubs and having flashing lights inviting me to a VIP room. So I think there's a number of ways that you can deal with advertising that takes different forms, but simply put, yes, I don't like the way that it pervades all parts of our societies and our communities. And so I think I'd be very open to ideas and suggestions from the questioner in particular, but also in taking action on this. As I've articulated earlier, the government has a strong position on this. It goes further than advertising. It also relates to donations from pubs and clubs, and of course the cashless gaming card I spoke about. It's a holistic package, but the further we can go on these things, the better, in my personal opinion. But I would really welcome if there's a particular idea on that, having a conversation with that questioner, because it's something that I'm personally very passionate about.
Thanks, Jordan. And Lyndall, so banning advertising for gambling. Thank you.
I'm afraid the candidates are in lockstep on this one. It's incredibly intrusive, and it's troubling as well because we know so often that the audience of those sporting events is quite young. We all often watch, whether it's a football game or cricket or the Olympics as a family with children, and the way that gambling advertising is sort of insidiously integrated into the sporting fields, decor and boundaries and even the commentary occasionally. It's insidious, it's intrusive, and we need to take a look at it. So again, this idea of the bipartisan support for gambling reform is a really important one. The banning of the donations from clubs, I think, is a really significant reform that both parties will take to the next and have taken to the next election and will implement in the next term. So I welcome that discussion. And it's a difficult conversation for our country to have because some of those sporting codes struggle for revenue, and we know how valuable they are when it comes to the contribution that they make to public life. It's probably no secret that I'm terrible at ball sports, but I recognise how enlightening and exciting and powerful they are, especially when you're there. But yeah, that intrusive gambling advertising, it needs to be scaled right back. Thank you for the question.
Thanks, Lyndall. And I think it's okay when the parties are in alignment on something, right? That's not actually a bad thing. We don't have to be in opposition just for the sake of it. Okay, so moving to climate change as a theme, the first question is, Christians believe that God gave mankind responsibility for the stewardship of the earth. We've not been doing a great job recently. Given that environmental degradation and climate change affects the poor and vulnerable the most, what are the top couple of policies your party would implement to make the most difference in this area? Thank you, Lyndall. I think you're up first this time.
I'm really passionate about this topic. So part of the reason that I wanted to teach geography was because it has a really comprehensive coverage of environmental management and climate change in the syllabus. So it's really rewarding for me to have conversations with students about how our climate works, how humans are changing that climate and impacting it, and what needs to happen to address that and to mitigate the human impact on climate change. So for my local party, for my state party, I think there's some really important reforms, particularly in the last week. So Chris Minns announced a $1 billion corporation, the New South Wales Energy Security Corporation. So this is about making climate change even more financially viable, even more climate change mitigation more financially viable and more ready to be implemented than it already is. So we know that technology is going to play a key role in reducing our emissions, in achieving a low emissions economy. And so what we have as part of this Energy Security Corporation is a partnership between government and business, often early stage business that needs the assistance of early stage funds for de-risking in order to take manufacturing to a scaled up level and actually deliver that. So we expect that this New South Wales Energy Security Corporation will achieve greater rollout of renewable energy infrastructure in our state, and importantly, that will be built here. So it's about making these energy security manufacturing processes. The early stage businesses are supported by the corporation and they develop into local manufacturing, and we achieve this virtuous circle of reduced emissions with New South Wales businesses. It's a fantastic idea. There's a whole range really, and what I'm most proud of is the achievement of a net zero economy for our state is very much supported by a very specific roadmap by New South Wales Labor. But one that everybody wants to talk about is the koalas and the Great Koala Park. So another thing that New South Wales Labor has announced is that we will deliver an enormous section of land on the north coast, which will cover 22% of New South Wales's remaining koala population. Koalas in this state are endangered, and that is a very sad indictment on development, on deforestation in our state. We must act to protect these precious animals, which are a core part of our tourism, but also our native environment. Thanks.
Thanks, Lyndall, appreciate that. And Jordan, so given that environmental degradation and climate change affects the poor and vulnerable the most, what are the top couple of policies your party would implement to make the most difference in this area? Thank you.
I know you said a couple, but I might try and do three if I can. First and foremost, we've got the most ambitious emissions reduction target anywhere in the country, which I actually announced with the Treasurer and the Minister for the Environment a number of months ago. That's important because that sets the framework of where you want to go. That drives policy, that drives the agenda. The work that's being done, essentially the government has said they'll take any and all means necessary to ban PEP11. For those of you that don't know, that's quite a controversial oil rig off the coast of Sydney, not the coast of some regional area, the coast of Sydney. So I think it's vitally important that that gets done. And then the other thing which I have a personal interest in is the work that's been done over the previous term in establishing what's called a renewable energy zone. And for those of you that don't know, renewable energy zones are basically economic powerhouses driven off the back of new environmental technology. It's creating jobs, it's creating investment, but also doing things that are good for the climate, good for energy generation. I think that this sort of business prospectus style of approach to how you do climate change and environment policy and energy policy as well is really important, because you get that capital investment from the private sector as much as you get community investment in what is, of course, a really important cause. So I know I did three, not two, but that's my answer.
Thanks so much. So another question on climate change. And so, Jordan, you're up first this time. And it's a person who's picked up one of your earlier comments. Jordan mentioned transport improvements. With climate change becoming more of an issue, what sustainable transport initiatives and plans are most important to you? So this is bringing that climate lens down onto transport. Thank you.
I could talk to you about this all day. When I was at university, I did a whole lot of study on big infrastructure and active transport. So it's something that I'm particularly passionate about. I'm also a cyclist, so I'm very interested in active transport and how you can get people around via alternative methods. So I think that's probably one part of the solution, is being able to ensure that we can get people who are travelling shorter distances out of cars and walking and riding. I think that some of the work we've done in partnership at a council level with the state government has been really important to unlock some of our green spaces, our waterways, to make them more attractive with shared user paths. I'm sure a lot of you have used them yourselves. The other thing, though, of course, on a much broader scale, is how do you incentivise public transport access? There's probably a few ways that you can do that. One is to make the last mile distance between the person's home and the public transport node more attractive. You can do that through investment in parking, so people that do choose to drive can park rather than drive all the way to work. And I can give you one good example, which is at West Ryde, of a commuter car park, which has just meant that people who, and I've got friends who used to drive all the way into the city, who now drive a short distance, 1.5 kilometres to West Ryde, tap on with the Opal card, so they're parking for free, get on the train, take the rest of the journey. I think that's really important. And then I alluded in my earliest comments around one of my big priorities on the future horizon around Victoria Road. We want to get people out of cars, but if buses, which is where this Victoria Road solution comes in, if buses are only driving in the same traffic that everybody else is, why would you catch a bus? So the idea is by being able to make those roads move better, investing in those dedicated lanes so that you can get people who would otherwise reject the bus because it sits in the same traffic onto the bus. That is another really, really important mechanism because Sydney's growing. We need to make these decisions now, but we need to make them not just for now, but for the next 10, 15, 20 years and beyond. So that's what the platform that I'm running on is all about. Long-term vision, long-term focus, and investments, substantial investments in really long-term infrastructure.
Thanks, Jordan. I really appreciate that answer as well. So, Lyndall, with that lens of climate change, what sustainable transport initiatives and plans are most important to you? Thank you.
Firstly, it is great to hear that there's progress on the widening of the road, Victoria Road at West Ryde. Of course, that was announced again before the last election as a project that our current state member would focus on in this term. And so I'm delighted to hear that it's moved to the point of announcing a feasibility study in the next term. So let's get moving with that. It's really interesting to hear that you would increase the use of buses if you're going to privatise those buses and then cut routes. So the Ryde bus region has experienced 8 routes either being reduced or cut since the buses were privatised in our area in 2018. So one thing that New South Wales Labor will do is in the first 6 months hold a bus task force and hold those organisations to account when it comes to service level and delivery, because we are experiencing reduced services when it comes to buses in our area. People are crying out for more access to buses, and it gets people off the roads, it reduces emissions overall. So that would be a key priority for me. It's one of my focuses in the short term, particularly the M52. Other things that Labor will do is we have announced a community battery scheme. We want to make it easier for people to use electric vehicles. We know that that is a key way of reducing emissions. It has been controversial in the past, it shouldn't be. It's an opt-in scheme. It's worked very well in other parts of the world, notably Europe. There are disincentives and there are challenges, of course, with the geography of Australia in relation to electric vehicles, but many people are finding it works very well. It's just that issue of access to those community batteries that we can improve on. And finally, Labor will double the active transport budget in the New South Wales budget. So we really want to make it possible for more people to cycle around our city. For myself, I have done it. I cycled for a short period as a commuter. It's a fantastic way of getting around our city, but it's scary and dangerous sometimes. So we need to find ways to make that safer, and it's got so many benefits, of course, flow-on benefits through our health system as well, we know. So yes, active transport, buses, and making sure that people have an increased capacity to switch to electric vehicles where it's appropriate for them.
Thank you. Thanks, Lyndall. So, Lyndall, you'll be up again first this time. And a question from the floor on the topic of gay conversion therapy. Will you protect the right, as it now stands, for ministers of the church or any faith to pastorally care for and pray for someone seeking to live faithfully to a Christian sexual ethic? Thank you.
It's really important for individuals to be able to have conversations with their ministers, with the person who ministers to their faith, about any question of faith. And that is something that New South New South Wales Labor supports and will support in the implementation of a ban on gay conversion therapy. The ban on gay conversion therapy is currently a bipartisan position, so both the Liberal Party and the Labor Party have expressed support for this ban. New South Wales Labor's position is that we aren't starting from a point of the Alex Greenwich bill, and we aren't starting from a point necessarily of what's been implemented in Victoria, but we will find a way to make the conversion of people's sexuality where they are compelled to undergo therapy, usually and often as children. We'll find a way to make that stop, to ban it, because of the research which tells us that it does long-term psychological harm to young people. So, speaking as a person of faith, I believe personally that same-sex relationships are completely of the same status as other types of relationships, as heterosexual relationships. So I don't support opposition to that ban. However, I do recognise and value an individual's relationship with their minister, and any questions of grappling with their own faith, those questions are private and should be protected by any future legislation.
Thanks, Lyndall. Jordan, will you protect the right, as it now stands, for ministers of churches or any faith to pastorally care for and pray for someone seeking to live faithfully to a Christian sexual ethic? Thank you.
Look, I probably don't have a whole lot more to add to what Lyndall said. Obviously, the position that we start from is one of relative bipartisanship. I think that importantly on this issue, we need to be working very closely, and I think this is an important group of people in this room, and so I think we need to consult very closely with church communities. I've no issue with people praying for others, but I do think that we need to get into the intricacies of legislation and have those conversations in close consultation with those that it will affect, and of course make evidence-based decisions as well. So that's my principal starting point, but I don't have legislation that I can sort of give you a view on right now whether I'd vote for or against. I simply haven't seen it, but it would be a discussion we would have to have, of course.
Thanks, Jordan, for that answer. Now, this one, I don't know how I can ask this of both of you. So, Lyndall, I'm going to have to ask this one just of you, I think. So, Jordan, you can help me on how you could deal with this one. But anyway, so the question is, where is Labor planning to locate the new Macquarie Park School? So I think it's more specific because there's a particular funding promise, but Macquarie Park looks full.
I suspect that the person that asked the question knows the answer because it was part of the announcement, but we don't have a site for that. It's the suburb of Macquarie Park is the commitment. The timeline is the construction will start in the next term of government. It's very difficult from opposition to have understandings of business cases, of progress that departments have already undertaken, and to see that from the inside is hard to do from opposition. So my commitment is a new high school for the suburb of Macquarie Park, and the site, of course, and the construction will commence in the next term.
I know the question wasn't for me, but in fact it was the first announcement that I made when I was endorsed as the candidate for this election, which was to build a new K-12 high school at Macquarie Park. Our site is just adjacent to Halifax Street in Macquarie Park, which is north of Epping Road.
Thank you. So another question picking up the topic of privatisation that's been commented on previously. So probably for yourself first, Jordan, do you support the privatisation of government assets and services? And are there plans for any further privatisations, and probably with a little bit of a Liberal Party topic in terms of, if not, why wouldn't the Premier rule out the privatisation of Sydney Water? Thank you.
He did. That happened, I think, this morning on national radio for possibly a third time. He has been quite emphatic that that is not the case. I'm not going to enter into a political to and fro here, but there's a very clear position, and anyone who says otherwise is clearly trying to play games with something that is simply factual. I don't support the sale per se of assets. In fact, when I was the mayor, one of the things that I established was the Ryde Future Fund. We're at the early stages of a framework of how we can create a new model going forward for the council to actually take on new assets so that we can generate new revenue, new wealth, and create opportunities for future generations. I've got a track record when it comes to dealing with public assets, and I think that it's the same ethos, the same principles that guided my decisions then that would guide me if I'm successful in March as to how we deal with public assets at a state level as well. We need to deal with them carefully. We need to ensure that we're realising value, but put simply, I'll say it for a fourth time today, there's certainly no plan. There's nothing at all when it comes to Sydney Water. I've already spoken about my plans for Sydney Water. I want to see that site opened up to the public. That's what you'll get if you elect me in March, an opened up, activated and exciting new precinct for West Ryde right there on the Sydney Water land.
So just to be really clear, it hasn't been ruled out. The privatisation of Sydney Water hasn't been ruled out. And the reason that that's a problem for the Labor Party is that the similar wording was used just before the last election and the precedent was set there where West Connex was privatised. The Sydney Water site, I was down there a couple of weeks ago with Chris Minns talking about the questions of privatisation, and the pump house, when I mentioned to one of the staff who works there what a wonderful and glorious heritage building it is and, you know, potential opportunities to open it up, she said, it's a pump house. It's a functioning pump house. It's the largest pump house in the Southern Hemisphere, and it has very little capacity to be opened up as a cultural centre in the near term because it's working very hard as a pump house. So it is a glorious building and we must protect it. It's also a very important pump house for Sydney's water, which will stay in public hands under New South Wales Labor.
It's always dangerous, isn't it? There's got to be something that's a little bit more sort of party political, but there you go. So I think as we finish up, we're going to come back out of sort of policy area and into possibly some more personal sort of reflections on who you are. So first question is, what is your greatest local achievement to date? So Lyndall, over to you first. What's your greatest local achievement to date?
Gosh, the first thing that comes into my head when I say that is my daughter. So I haven't served as a local government councillor in this area, so I won't have a laundry list of outcomes that I can speak to that Jordan no doubt can, having served as a local government councillor. My council time was in the Inner West, where I was very proud to protect heritage buildings, fight for retention of public land, help to secure the future of Callan Park, although I know that that's still ongoing. So working with different levels of government, working with the community to deliver great outcomes for that community. More recently, my time in Ryde has been focused on small, quiet achievements that relate to things like P&Cs and my church and my family and my work as a teacher, which is outside this area in Western Sydney. So I honestly have to come back to that. My greatest local achievement is my girl.
Thanks, Lyndall. I appreciate the honesty of your situation. Thank you. Jordan, what is your greatest local achievement to date? Thank you.
One of the things I'm particularly proud of is that last year, the City of Ryde actually cut rates. It was probably the only council anywhere in the city, anywhere in New South Wales. I've been researching this, trying to find somebody else that did it, and I just don't think that they're there. We were only able to do that because we've made smart, strategic financial decisions, because we have a long-term economic plan and vision for the future. And so when you make those sorts of decisions, you can afford to make decisions that reward what has been an incredible contribution from our community over the last 2 or 3 years, particularly through COVID-19. We work very, very closely with local Ryde residents, but we knew that they were doing it tough, and so it was something that we were able to do. And as I say, to date, I'm yet to find another council that was able to do it, and that's what drives me, being able to help as many people as I possibly can in a broad array of little local communities here in this area. And the number one way you can do that as a council is by taking off some of that financial burden. So everything else was going up, your rates were going down, and I think that that is the same sort of low taxing sort of approach that I would take as a state representative. We need to make sure people can keep more money in their own pockets. It's as simple as this. You are able to live a more fulfilling and better life. You have more money to spend, and I don't think government should be getting in the way of that. And that's what my mayoralty will be in large part defined by, and what I hope that future councils can continue to deliver. It's certainly what I'll be doing if I'm successful in March.
Thanks, Jordan. So to finish up, and thank you everyone for your questions. I think that's been really amazing. I haven't used any of mine that I pre-prepared yet, so thanks to everyone for your questions. So I'm going to finish with one of mine because I've got the right to do that. And so to finish off, you've each commented on this a little on the way through, but I think it would be really helpful to just finish with what motivated you to move into politics. Why state government, and what is it that attracts you about this? Thanks, Jordan.
I always had an interest growing up. This is quite a political community. We used to have a Prime Minister as our local MP. So the discussions around the dining room table were always a little bit about politics. But I think that that interest really manifested when, and I did allude to this in my previous answer, I was looking around a community that I've lived in my entire life. And I'm a relatively young man, and in that time there had been an extraordinary amount of change, and not always the sort of change that I wanted to see. It wasn't that there isn't a place for people to help our growing city, it's that nothing was coming to accommodate it, to invest in the people, to invest in the amenity, to invest in that social infrastructure. And so that's why I ran for council, because I thought that I could get in there and make a difference, and a difference we did make. But it was also along that journey that I got to work particularly closely with a very capable and forward vision focused state government as well, and particularly the local MP, Victor Dominello. As a councillor and as a mayor, he and I did a lot together. We were able to go out and save open spaces like TG Milner. We were able to invest in future infrastructure by getting the council settings right to sustain the major state government investments. Things around the metro, things around the hospital, which is forthcoming. These are all new schools as well. Little things, being able to make sure the precinct had the right greenery planted so that it would look nice when people came to the school on their first day. These things only happen if you're able to work closely with your colleagues. And so when Victor made his announcement that he'd be retiring, I thought that the best thing that I could do to honour the legacy was to continue it and build upon it. And so that's why I'm here today, because I think the work that's been in the pipeline has delivered so much for Ryde, but there's so much more to do. And my focus is on that long-term future horizon, building off what he's done, doing even more, making it better, and leaving Ryde a better place than hopefully it was when I first found it, when I ran for council.
Thanks, Jordan. And Lyndall, for yourself, what's motivated you to move into politics, and why state government, and what is it that attracts you about this? Thank you.
Yeah, I was thinking about that today. I've actually been involved in politics for a long time. I'm quite a bit older than Jordan, and I lived overseas for nearly 5 years straight out of university, and lived in London and had a lot of fun and travelled around Europe, but was consistently troubled by the very visible poverty that I saw in London. Parts of the United Kingdom are wonderfully wealthy and beautiful and tourism attractions, and other parts are terribly, terribly sad places to live. And one media story that deeply affected me when I lived there was a 2-year-old girl who died of malnutrition in London. She had never eaten anything other than chicken nuggets, and her young mother didn't know that that would be a problem, and they'd also barely left their apartment. So this meant that there were no social welfare networks, there were no community links, there was no one to tap her on the shoulder and teach her how to be a mother. And in a first world country like the United Kingdom, somebody died of malnutrition. And I was deeply affected by that, and I came home and joined the Australian Labor Party because I wanted to be in the room when decisions are being made about how to make the world a better place. It sounds like a motherhood statement, but I honestly believe that you need to be an optimist to be in politics. You have to believe that solutions can be found, that people can work together, and that things can be improved. So I came home, joined the Labor Party a couple of years later, served as a local government councillor, and have been involved in quiet ways ever since, serving on committees in that party and serving on various local committees in my local community. I stepped up to run for state parliament more recently because as a teacher, I could see that the education system in our state was under extreme pressure. And it continues to be under extreme pressure and will continue to be under extreme pressure under a Liberal National Coalition. I firmly believe that. So as a teacher, I want to serve in state parliament because state parliament is about service delivery. It is about schools and hospitals. It is about roads and public transport. It's about all those things that make an economy churn, that deliver jobs, that deliver safe, healthy places for us to live. So I want to serve as Ryde's Member of Parliament because I believe that we can do better. I'm an optimist when it comes to the significant social problems that our state is facing, the significant decline we are seeing in learning as a result of the pressures in our schools, and I believe that we can do better. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lyndall. Thank you, Lyndall, and thank you, Jordan. I think tonight has been a fantastic chance, as I said at the start, these opportunities to actually hear in a different forum and in a more fulsome way from our potential local members of Parliament, I think is a really great chance for us all. So thanks for being here this evening. I think we want to give both of them a round of applause for how they've handled it. And we have supper served in the back hall here afterwards, and I'm sure you'll both be willing to stay around for a little bit and chat with people. And I might just pray for us as we finish up now. Heavenly Father, we come before you now very grateful for the democracy that we have in Australia, for the ability to share ideas freely and do it in a way that's respectful of each other as well. Lord God, as I prayed at the beginning, we don't know where this election will land, but we do trust in your sovereignty that you will look after the people of this state through the elected officials. And we ask that whoever it is that forms government, that they'll do so wisely and on behalf of all people. We thank you for Lyndall and for Jordan being here this evening to share of themselves and to help us understand their perspective on all these different issues. And we ask that you'll bless them in the weeks to come, give them strength for the time ahead, and the ability to work graciously through this whole election process. And we thank you for this chance tonight to meet and to share this time together. In Jesus' name, amen. So supper is served through the door on your right. Thank you, everyone.